Thank you, Chairman. The advantage of waiting is you get to hear lots of good questions, and I was glad to get to hear my colleagues' questions. It's good to see both of you here today, particularly Secretary McHugh, who we worked so closely together for so long. Secretary McHugh, you mentioned the problem of CR after CR. How much of that was taken care of and what was done last month, and what are your priorities moving forward in terms of structuring for the next spending year, what you'd hope would be there?
Well, the PL 113-6, I believe, was the number that gave us what the Chief and I have been talking about, that is predictability and stability. And it was an important step with respect to being able to redirect funds. We were initially estimating that a year-long continuing resolution would cost us about $6 billion. So by interrupting that progression, it saved us some money, but most importantly, allowed us to take funds and do what we consider our prime objective for the moment, and that is continue to provide for the warfighters. As to the way ahead, I think it's important for everyone to understand that the things that we're going to have to do, the things we've already done here in 13, will in some instances take a year, multiple years to fix, regardless of what we may do in 14 in adopting either the Senate resolution, the President's proposed budget, or the House resolution, because we're just creating holes that don't get fixed overnight. For example, at the Aviation Center of Excellence at Fort Rucker, sequestration will probably require the reduction of more than 500 training seats. Those just don't get recreated in a year's time. The Chief mentioned about how we'll only be able to do 2 BCT rotations at our NTC. All of those other rotations will be put back into the queue. It's not like they'll make up that readiness in a 6-month period. So those are holes that are, even under the best of circumstances as we can see it, that we're going to be dealing with for some time. But at least with predictability and an on-time budget, and you know, if not the elimination, certainly the control of CRs, we're going to be significantly challenged in the way ahead.
Well, it'd be great if we could eliminate CRs, and it's our job, and we ought to do our best to do that. And you mentioned the overseas contingency accounts. I wanted to be sure I understood what your concern was there.
Well, money.
That there's too much money in contingencies you no longer need, no, or there's not enough money.
There's not enough money in the current OCO account, the overseas contingency account. Our estimation is that we're about $7.8 billion short of what the Army needs to fund the warfighters through the end of this year. That's why we're having to make all of these cuts that degrade readiness that go into our base budgets, because we're moving money out of our base into the what should be the funded OCO accounts, in our view, to support that warfighter. Our prime goal is not to send anyone into harm's way or into Korea or as part of the global response force that is without what they absolutely need, and that's the commitment we make. But right now, we're hard-pressed to do that.
Okay. Thank you. General, following up on your conversation with Senator Reid, how has the recruitment strategy been impacted by the reduction strategy?
So the one thing that we have to be able to do is sustain the balance of people coming in the Army as they leave. So, for example, because we had a larger number of people leave the Army this year than anticipated, we increased our recruiting level by about 5,000 this year. And in the active component, we're meeting that. We have to always sustain the balance between recruiting and as soldiers leave, because if you don't do it by year group, and you get out of balance, you create holes in your force over time. So as we've increased the amount of soldiers leaving, we've had a small increase in those we're recruiting. The quality of recruits that we're bringing in this year are the highest they've been, and over the last 3 years we've had the least amount of waivers, the highest level of education that the Army has seen in since we've been keeping track of records. So for now, we're doing okay, but we are worried 14, 15, 16, as the economy continues to get better, and frankly, this unpredictability that we have, how will that contribute to people wanting to come into the Army? So we're concerned about the out years, because even though we're reducing, you got to keep those fresh people coming in every single year.
And the reduction of some of the reductions would actually not impact in a negative way your intake numbers. Your intake numbers are still going to be pretty high. Is that what I understand?
It is. I mean, so when we were growing the Army, they were much higher, but they're about 65,000 this year is how many we're bringing in to the active component, and we're bringing in more to the National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve. And so that number continues, and we got to stay consistent with that number. As the overall end strength of the Army goes down, that will reduce. It'll probably get down sometime in 2 or 3 years from now to about 55,000 a year. But we have to continue to bring people in every single year.
Right. Well, to repeat some of what's been said, as you look at the brigade, the combat, the BCT restructuring, you know, the facility I'd be most familiar with would be Fort Leonard Wood, and just the two things that occur to me there are the proximity to the schools, to the training and doctrine schools, and then the location of that and other bases if at some point you need to support civil authorities because of incidents that happen here. I would hope those would be two of the things you'd put into the matrix of trying to make that decision. Mr. Secretary, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I would tell you one of the newer criteria or factors is that geographical balance. And so that's something we're going to look at very carefully. That, frankly, responds to the issue you said, so that we are located to work in support of civil authorities where and when as necessary, but also helps with keeping the Army relevant to the American population as a whole. I worry about us becoming isolated unto ourselves, and the more places we can maintain presence and American communities can look across a patch of land or a piece of water and see in this case, an Army base, a camp, post, or station, I think is a good day. So geographic dispersal and equity is part of our consideration.
Okay. General Odierno, we had General Alexander from Cyber Command in the other day, and when you were talking earlier, I think with Senator Manchin, about the Guard versus the readiness of the full-time force, I actually, in talking to him and some things we're looking at, I think Cyber Command could be a place where guardsmen and reservists are likely to be doing every day in the private sector the same kind of skill set that we are going to need in Cyber Command. And would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, as we look at cyber warfare as we go forward, there's several things. One is national cyber capability, and then we have both operational and tactical cyber capability that we have to sustain in the Army as we go forward. So what we have to do is we're building structure in the active, and we have to have mirrored structure in the National Guard and Reserve, because as you say, we think that's a good place for us to have some of this key capability that we would need to do operational, tactical, national level cyber capability. So as we are looking, as we're waiting for Cybercom to develop its requirements, and then we will develop to meet the requirements they have for each one of the services, and then we have to develop our own requirements for operational and tactical cyber. And so what we want the National Guard and Reserves to do is mirror our structure, because we're going to need them as we move forward. And then, of course, what comes along with that is training and everything else. And we'll make sure that they get the match training, because that's something I think would be an important mission. So what we have to balance, though, is the requirements of the state with the requirements that we have federally, and that's what we have to think our way through.
That's true. At one time when I was Secretary of State of Missouri, the securities responsibilities of the, investment were in my office, and the Securities Commissioner worked for me and others, and my view was that every time we brought in somebody from the private sector, they actually had some strengths that diminished as they got away from that daily contact with the vigor of the private sector. I think in cyber you're going to see some of that same thing. So people who are out there trying to protect their own networks, trying to do the things that are going to be critical in that responsibility. I think this is a place where the Guard Reserve component is more likely, frankly, to be, particularly if they're well placed in their civilian role, more likely to be kept up to date than they might be in some of the other areas you were visiting about earlier. And I just would hope we'd all keep that in mind as we look at the potential of some of these cyber units in the Guard.